Hello, everybody. If you are not familiar with me, my name is Dr. Robert Duff. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. And first things first, this place is a mess. Please excuse that. It's the holidays. Everyone in this house is sick. I'm a little sick. That's why my throat's a bit scratchy. So, gonna have to deal with a little bit of that. I wanted to come on today to respond to an article. So, there was an article on the New York Times, and I have it pulled up on my screen here, called Sweethearts Forever, Then Came Alzheimer's, Murder, and Suicide. And it was by Karina Knoll. And Karina Knoll posted on Twitter the headline, "A man shot his wife with Alzheimer's, then killed himself. I wanted to understand their story. Turns out it was one of love." And this is something that has gotten on Twitter, as I was scrolling through and saw this, a lot of really strong reactions. A lot of people saying that this was essentially murder of a disabled person, that this was not love, that this was selfishness, and some things like that. And I have some thoughts about it that I wanted to share. First, before that, I want to talk about sort of my background, how I'm approaching this. So, I don't have anybody personally in my life that has Alzheimer's disease. None of my grandparents lived long enough to acquire the disease. But my position professionally, I'm what's called a clinical neuropsychologist. That's my day job. So when I'm not doing this stuff, the psych stuff, I actually spend my days testing people for dementia conditions such as Alzheimer's disease. What I do is I basically meet with them and go through some interview and background with them and their families. Then I do a series of tests to look at their thinking abilities, things like memory, things like language, things like processing speed, things like more complex reasoning or problem solving, along with behavioral things like, anxiety, depression symptoms, looking at things that might change like delusions or hallucinations, agitation, all sorts of stuff like that to get a full picture of how this person is doing compared to if we have any baseline from the past and compared to what's normal for somebody of that age and that education level. So my job is often to work with people's neurologists to help zero in on what's going on. So with their neurologist, who's a medical doctor, often they're getting brain scans, looking at labs, things like that. And then I'm looking at the cognitive side of things to say, okay, we're seeing these certain areas where maybe there's a skill that's diminished, reduction in someone's abilities, and that lines up to this area of the brain. Mapping that out with everything else, it looks like this type of disorder may be going on. It's a lot about, trying to triangulate, find patterns and stuff like that. So I do work with a lot of people that have Alzheimer's disease, and I'm actually in the position of sometimes breaking that news to them or confirming that fear for them. When I have my feedback sessions, I sit down with them for an hour, the patient, their family, and talk about what the results might indicate. Now, with Alzheimer's disease, really the best way to tell if someone has Alzheimer's is after they've passed, looking at a brain autopsy. But we can get pretty dang close through things like imaging, the type of testing that I do, which is called neuropsychological assessment, and sort of just looking at the history. A lot of people also have some confusion about what Alzheimer's disease actually means and how that relates to dementia. So I want to clear that up really quickly. Dementia is essentially a category of functioning. What it means is that somebody has thinking skills, so cognitive abilities that have deteriorated, gotten worse to the point that they now aren't able to live their lives independently in a successful way. So we would call that a functional decline, a decline in their functional abilities. So, if somebody's cognitive difficulties now cause them to be unable to administer medications to themselves appropriately, or they forget to feed themselves, don't know how to prepare food for themselves, they can't, use the bathroom or shower safely because of their cognitive difficulties, whatever it is, once it reaches that point where it's significantly interfering with their functional abilities, that's when something would qualify as dementia. Before that, we would call it something that we call a mild cognitive impairment, and there are more complicated terms for this now. They call it neurocognitive disorder. There's a lot of terminology, but basically you have normal functioning, then you move into mild impairment, and then once it gets impactful enough, then you call it dementia. And there's a lot of different things that can cause somebody to have dementia. Alzheimer's is the most common one. Now, Alzheimer's disease is a disease of the brain. It's a disease that actually causes the neurons in the brain, the cells that communicate with one another, to break down. And you can see this in imaging. They leave behind basically wreckage, things called plaques and tangles, where the neurons are dying off and there's this wreckage left behind. And it starts at a certain area of the brain, which are the temporal lobes, so on the sides. And those are the areas of the brain that have to do with language and memory. So with Alzheimer's in the early stages, what you see is short-term memory difficulties, things like asking repetitive questions, forgetting where you went to dinner the night before, repeat conversations, things like that. And then eventually you start getting some language difficulties. So word finding, forgetting what the name of the thing stapler, right? You start to have like those sort of brain farts and word finding difficulties. And then as it progresses, the language gets more severe. Sometimes people will get what's called aphasia, or they inevitably will, likely, when they have Alzheimer's, which is really just an impairment in language. So trouble expressing themselves appropriately. They may say words that don't make sense or are similar but wrong. Like instead of saying we need to wait 15 minutes, they might say we need to wait 15 miles. Words start to not fully make sense, and they might have trouble understanding what people say to them. Then we get long-term memory difficulties, and as the disease progresses, it spreads throughout the brain. So starting in that one area, but then spreading. And as you get into these other areas, you get things like behavioral changes. Someone might get more agitated or turn inward, become much more depressed, quiet, introverted, where they used to be more outgoing. Problems with reasoning and problem solving, other personality changes. It can really run the gamut when you get into the later stages. And then eventually, Alzheimer's ends up killing the person. And when I say that, I don't mean that like their brain stops working in one night, shuts off. That's not how it goes. It's actually kind of brutal the way that it works. Basically, Alzheimer's breaks down, the brain so much that the person is unable to do normal activities successfully. And a lot of people, for instance, end up choking or getting pneumonia, and that kills them because their brain can't fully coordinate how to chew and swallow food. Other times it's something like they fall and they don't know how to call for help. They can't figure out what to do to solve the situation. Wandering. People sometimes with Alzheimer's will wander if they're able to get outside their house. They'll start walking aimlessly, wind up, very far away, dehydrated, again, not able to figure out how to call for help or appropriately get help. They call it complications. Somebody dies from complications of Alzheimer's disease, and that's essentially the inevitable endpoint. So it's a brutal disorder, and there's nothing that we have right now that can cure it, and there's nothing that we have right now that can dramatically impact the progression of it, meaning how fast or slow it moves. It's a little bit different for everybody. Some people very rapidly decline. Some people take longer. But even things like the medications for Alzheimer's disease, such as Aricept, those are a class of medications. You don't have to remember this, but they're called acetylcholine esterase inhibitors. Those are basically medications that just let your neurons fire more quickly. There's a complicated way it does that, essentially stopping a certain molecule from being eaten up within the brain, which allows it to go on and help other neurons. You don't need to know that, but what you do need to know is that a lot of doctors will say this slows down the progression of Alzheimer's. It does not. It covers up the symptoms a little bit for some people. It makes you have maybe a little boost to memory, a little bit more alertness. But under the surface, that disease process is still carrying on and the brain is still breaking down. And once the medication reaches that limit of usefulness, it can seem like there's a steep drop off because that covering isn't happening anymore and the disease has been progressing. So all this is to say, I have a lot of experience with working with people with Alzheimer's disease. I have a lot of experience in telling people that they have Alzheimer's disease, which I don't enjoy doing. And I would probably consider acquiring Alzheimer's disease to be one of my, if not my worst fear in life. Because it inevitably ends in a poor quality of life. During the early stages, things are easier. You worry about keeping the person comfortable and happy. As it goes on, you're adjusting to some of the more behavioral changes and the more severe memory difficulties. Eventually, someone's fully dependent on care, and then eventually they're fully dependent on professional level care, where everything they do needs to be done by somebody else. So it sucks. It's a shitty disorder, and I hate it, And I really, really, really hope that in the near future we're able to make some strides toward actual solutions to it. Right now, the best solutions seem to be more on the prevention side, but that's neither here nor there. The story here is that somebody, this man, was in love with his wife. They had a great relationship by all accounts, married for quite a few years, 60 years, wife of 60 years. She eventually acquired Alzheimer's and got dementia from it. And she was, I think, 80. And the family found the husband and wife up in their bedroom in their home. He had shot her in the head and then shot himself. So murder suicide. Now, the way that the article is presenting it is basically this was an act of love because he couldn't bear to see her like this. She wasn't surviving. She wasn't living a good quality life and all of that. But the problem that people have with this article is that this doesn't seem to be her choice. There wasn't any sort of documentation or anything that said this is what she wanted. This seems to be this man who took it upon himself to decide that his wife's life needed to be over as well as his. There is, a sort of almost near romantic Romeo and Juliet sort of thing going on here. At least that's what the article is sort of picking up on. But there are a lot of problems with this scenario. And if you read the article, I'll leave a link to it. It may be behind a paywall. It's on the New York Times, so hopefully you'll be able to access it. It was published on December 29th, 2019. And again, that's by Karina Knoll, Knoll. But like I said, I'll put a link in the description here. But there was a lot of problems, one of which was they banded together, the husband and wife, which is normal. But the husband sort of hid a lot of the problems and took it upon himself to be the primary caretaker and to not want to cause a burden to the rest of the family. And they really, really, really wanted to avoid putting her or him into a home, so into like a skilled nursing facility or assisted living facility or something like that. So there's the sort of the start of maybe like a little bit of the irresponsibility. And it sounds like, at least from what I can gather from the article, a lot of this wasn't her. A lot of this was him saying, you're not going to put my wife in this place. I can tend to her needs, et cetera, et cetera. Very common, unfortunately. And what a lot of people don't realize is that, okay, well, at a certain point, yes, being in the home is more comfortable if you're able to swing it. But as the disease progresses, things get impossibly difficult to deal with. And there are professionals and professional settings that are built for that type of thing. Memory care units, for instance, that are built in such a way so the person can't just walk out into the street. They have built-in activities, people who can answer their questions over and over if they need to, ways to redirect them, things that are built to face the unfortunate reality of this type of memory impairment. But this person, this man, kept all of that essentially to himself and from the family. And as things continued to get worse and worse, he inevitably was going to be having a harder time with it. Looks like he had his own health problems as well, which again is very common when two elderly people remain together. Both people tend to get some medical problems. And so, like I said, he took it upon himself to kill his wife and kill himself. And the family sees it as an act of love and doesn't feel bitter about it, which I can understand as well to an extent. But what I do want to say is this is not the way to do it. I did talk to some people about this on Twitter and got, a little bit of extra feedback. And, the topic of assisted suicide, I think, is something that needs to be brought into the mix here. Because, to be honest, I think that people who receive a diagnosis of Alzheimer's should be considered to have a terminal illness. And for all intents and purposes, it is. A lot of places don't consider it to be a terminal illness, though. And many places, physician-assisted suicide is not legal for Alzheimer's disease. And that's tough, because what is your option then? If you're a person who understands the disease, so take me, for instance. Say when I'm, in my 70s or 80s, I am diagnosed with early Alzheimer's disease. If nothing changes between now and then, I know what that progression is like. I know what that looks like at the end of life. And I may not want that for myself and for my family, because I know the emotional, financial burden. I know the quality of life that I might have, et cetera, et cetera. So I may make the decision that once I get to a certain stage or maybe some sort of marker, I don't want to live anymore. But if it's illegal for a physician to help me with that, what is the other option, right? And this is sort of hypothetical because, as I said, in this case with this article, there was no evidence that this was a decision they came to together or anything like that. But if that were the case, what I would do if I were this person with Alzheimer's disease is I would set up some sort of legal documentation, or at the very least, notarize, trying to make it as official as possible, stating what my wishes are, and planning for that sort of end of life care or lack of care. It's almost like hospice. But again, when you're looking at Alzheimer's disease, often this isn't considered the same way as other terminal illnesses. So it might be a different story if they found a letter saying, to my family from this woman, I know what's going to happen to me as this disease goes on. I've talked to my husband about this. We've always wanted to go out of life the way that we live together. And so my plan is that once the time comes, we're going to, exit this world together, in our own bed, whatever, blah, blah, blah. That might be a different story because this was her wishes that she took down on paper and made official. In this case, I don't think that's what happened. I think that this man took it upon himself to act in his disabled wife's best interest, what he believed was his best interest. Was she going to die anyway? Yes, in not too long. The disease, complications of it would have killed her, but this isn't the way to go about that. And at the very least, this should have been a family decision, something that they talked about with the families, with the physicians, and tried to work together on this. So there's a lot of selfishness here involved with what this person did and in the situation, at least from the information that's provided here that I can gather from the article. Now, this is something that I don't have a perfect opinion about or perfect information about because things get complicated. So let's take a scenario where, say, you're in a place where physician-assisted suicide is legal for Alzheimer's disease. Say you set up your sort of end-of-life plan and you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's. You say, okay, once I get to the point where, I'm unable to feed myself or something like that, I no longer want to live. Well, you make that plan when you're in the early stages, but as the disease continues to ravage your brain, you're likely going to forget that you ever made those plans, right? So while you were of relatively sound mind when you made those plans, you're going to forget about that. And then what happens when you get to that point where you can't eat anymore, you can't function anymore, and you don't remember making those plans, and people tell you about them, but you refuse. You say, no, I don't want to die. What do you do with that, right? Instinct says, yeah, definitely you respect a person's right to not want to die. However, when you think about, the medical situation, there are other situations where somebody, with Alzheimer's or any other type of dementia that affects the cortex of the brain, such as frontotemporal dementia, they might be impaired in their decision making. And so at a certain point, they may lose their capacity to make decisions and somebody becomes their conservator who makes those medical decisions on their behalf. So could a conservator make that decision on their behalf when that person is saying no? I mean, morally, that sounds really, really terrible and wrong. But, these are questions that we kind of have to ask. And I wish there was more clarity about what we were supposed to do here. So at the very least, I think that the takeaways from this are it's important to not unilaterally act on someone's behalf when they have a disability, even if there's somebody that loves you and that you love. Even if it's something that's a terminal illness, even if it's something that's deteriorative like Alzheimer's disease, you can't just act unilaterally on their behalf. It's something that needs to be talked about. Ideally, it should be a family discussion. The person should be asked what they want early on when they do still have the capacity to, intelligently participate in these things and make some decisions for what they want to happen with them. If at all possible, document that. If at all possible, make legally binding documents. And really, if they haven't been tested yet, when they make those, that is a really, really important thing. It's very hard to go back and retroactively say what was somebody's capacity level. But if you're getting, like, say, neuropsych testing early on and somebody is clearly able to have capacity to make these decisions, then it's much harder to challenge those decisions later down the line by another family member or something like that. This is important for estate planning. This is important for end-of-life care and all that stuff. So those are my, somewhat rambly thoughts about this. I'm curious as to how this strikes you, both morally and sort of medically or scientifically. I don't agree with what this person did, and I do consider this to be more of a murder, suicide than sort of a graceful exiting of life. But I do admit that I don't have all the information. I don't know if they arrived at this decision together. I don't know if this is something they had talked about for a long time. I could certainly see my wife and I coming up with some harebrained scheme to off each other, when we're crippled and unable to function. So there could be something like that there, but there's no evidence of it at the very least. And this isn't how you do it. So I have complicated feelings about what end of life care could and should look like for Alzheimer's disease, but certainly husbands and wives shouldn't be killing each other, especially without consent. So those are my thoughts about it. Have a look at the article, have a look at some of the discourse on Twitter and other places, and let me know how you feel.